We have Pat Kent, President of the ICSA, Alice Mary Higgins, who is a policy analyst, senator and member of the Civil Engagement Group in the Senate at the moment. And then we have Seamus Maye, who is a member of the Public Banking Forum of Ireland and the European Small Business Alliance. And we're very grateful that we could actually get 3 speakers of their calibre here tonight, and I hope you enjoy what they have to say. The format is that each speaker will spend 15 minutes on a particular subject, and then they'll rotate and speak for about 10 minutes on their secondary subject, if you like. And when they've all had their turn, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
My name is Patrick Kent. I'm President of the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association. We represent about 10,000 members here in Ireland, and actually our General Secretary is from this county, County Clare. He's from near Cratloe. Eddie Punch is his name, very efficient, professional guy. I'll be with him in Brussels next week. And we'll be meeting a lot of MEPs and different organisations and so on there. One thing that I always notice going to Brussels is, if we weren't there, I worry. I tell you, the lobbying done by large corporations in Brussels is just phenomenal. The current situation is in the States, for every euro that the ordinary organisations and people spend, there's for every dollar they spend in the States, there's $37 spent lobbying by corporations, global corporations. And these corporations are getting more and more power, and they're undermining the sovereignty of little countries like ours, because the individual turnover of a company like Coca-Cola or whatever is so phenomenal it just dwarfs small countries, and so it's very worrying. And it's very worrying that they'll use a trade agreement, because certainly as a farmer, trade is one thing I grew up with, and it's a trade, I like to see trade, and trade is always good. You try and get a profit, and then sometimes you don't always get it, but you try and that's the way you make a living, you trade. And and agreements is good too. This country should be the agreement capital of the world, but instead we're joining things like PESCO, where our kids now are going to be conscripted into armies and so on. And I certainly, personally, wouldn't be in favour of that. When I think we should be the resolution capital of the world here, conflict resolution. The actual situation is speaking about CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with Canada, and you've seen pictures probably of our Taoiseach with the nice socks and so on, meeting the Prime Minister of Canada, another nice young man, and it all looks nice and rosy on the surface, and there's a great PR spin to it. But the reality behind that is these corporations have the lobbying power and the money, and they try and push through an ISDS mechanism, which Alice Marie will probably explain more about later. And these agreements undermine our sovereignty, and it's very, very worrying. As a 20-year-old, I travelled Canada because I had an aunt in Manitoba and an uncle in Toronto, and it's very friendly to the Irish, and it's a great country, and it's vast, and to tell you the size of it, it's mega big. I spent 2 days and 2 nights, 48 hours in a train, and I only got a third of the way across it in that time, travelling continuously. And I went by Greyhound on more of it, and I didn't travel more of it. So, all the way back to Newfoundland and so on, it's a vast country as well. The average farm size there is 10 times what it is in Ireland. There's vast feedlots. There's an alley. I've been in Alberta. It's a fantastic province. It's vast and it's very rich. Lots of oil, gas, uranium, everything that you could want there, and cattle grazing in between the oil pumps and so on. And there's a feedlot alley there. There's 2.5 million cattle being fed there south of in the southern part of Alberta state, and there's oil sands in the north. It's atrocious what's happening there. I believe if you go up as high as you can in a helicopter, you can't see the end of it. It's vast, and the actual field sizes there in Alberta are so big you can see the curvature of the earth. I'll just tell you, when you go with a combine, a friend of mine spent some time combining crops there, and he said it was the most boring place he ever spent, because he'd be travelling all day in one direction, or half the day in one direction, half the way coming back again, and it's just so vast. And they could, if they get access to, our market in Europe, they see us as for the plucking, rich pickings here. The average per capita income is okay in Europe, but the farm size, we're very vulnerable. We're very dependent on agriculture in Ireland. Beef is our main export. And lamb too is quite important, and dairy exports is quite good. But the cards being given to the other organisation is that they're going to get in with cheeses into the Canadian market, and they won't get in with cheeses into the Canadian market because the cheeses we produce here are not really. They're just bland cheeses that can be manufactured in the States. States can ramp up their dairy production very, very easily, and they produce these cheddars and cheese that go on burgers and so on. The only farmers that will benefit probably will be some of the Italians and French with the niche cheeses into the higher end restaurants and so on, and it'll be only a minuscule amount. But if they can get in, they'll undermine our market here with their beef. They can produce beef so much cheaper. But they're cheating all the way. They're using not alone. They'll tell us that they won't use stilbestrol and other hormones, but they will use food additives like rumensin and so on, which are antibiotics and cause an antibiotic resistance. If you've heard of E. coli 157, it originated in American feedlots, and fortunately we don't have it to any extent in Ireland, and we're very strict about cleanliness in our animals and so on. And but the animals there are they're in a different condition. They're just in their own excrement outdoors all the time, and even though it's minus 40, they still, if they feed them enough grain and all that, steam will be rising off them. They'll be very hot, and they'll be fed these antibiotics and so on. So the European consumer doesn't want to consume that product. They'll also be fed genetically modified, which I'll speak about later, feed as well, and that's not exactly what 60% of Europeans do not want to consume that. But I'll also mention about Mercosur, which is a group of South American countries, and we are also being used as a pawn to get into their markets there by the industrial end of Europe, the Germans, and that to get in with their cars, BMWs and Volkswagen and so on, into the South American Mercosur group countries, which is an alliance of about 5 to 6 countries in South America, and they want to get in there, but they don't mind sacrificing Irish beef farmers and Irish countryside and so on and so forth. Agriculture is on the brink here. It's just barely hanging on in the hope that things will turn around. But if a double blow comes, like between Brexit and Mercosur and CETA, if it all comes together, it'll be the end of Irish farming as we know it. The dairy model is a bubble, in my opinion, ready to burst. It's just when you have our EU Commissioner Phil Hogan given warning signs about it and they're being ignored. There was also warning signs given by David McWilliams and so on about the impending crash 10 years ago in the property business. And he was told by Bertie Ahern that he didn't know why people like him didn't go and hang themselves or do away with themselves. And it was, caused a bit of furore for a day. But it's the same situation. The warning signs have been given. There's the dairy bubble is not a Celtic tiger. It's a worldwide thing. It's a combination of lifting all the quotas in Europe at one time, combining that with increased technology in that robotic milking parlours and so on, and ramping up production using very cheap grain produced in the places like the United States of America, where it's heavily subsidised, and also using genetically modified technology, which is detrimental to human health from a lot of evidence that's available. So I won't hold on any longer, but I will come back and I will speak a little bit about GM and so on. So thanks very much.
And thanks for coming out tonight. And I know that Clare has been somewhere that has kind of really led in championing kind of the international perspectives and kind of holding the right to have your own ideas and perspectives on international issues which affect you. And I think it is kind of a laudable internationalist tradition within Clare. And so and of course, Clare declared itself a TTIP and CETA free zone, which I think was a very strong message at a very early stage when very few people were really paying attention and focusing in on the issues of trade. And first of all, to be very clear as well, I'm somebody who's very passionately pro-European. I was involved with the European Women's Lobby and the European Anti-Poverty Network, and I'm very much in favour of cooperation between peoples across Europe, and I'm also very much in favour of trade. But there is an important question we always need to ask about just what kind of trade, and is it trade that serves citizens, or is it trade that is designed to serve corporations alone? And what we've seen, particularly over the last 15 years or so, is increasing use of what they were calling, I think they're now probably, the phrase has become dated and we definitely need a new phrase, but new generation trade deals. That we definitely need a new generation of trade deals, but the new generation trade deals which have been coming through over the last 2 decades, with NAFTA as one of the examples early on in the US and others, and basically these are trade deals which placed corporations' interests ever more central in the trade deal and which have in many cases served to really undermine the normal operation of policy making and democracy in practical terms, and which included the big issue, which I'm going to come to in a moment, investor-state dispute settlements, so mechanisms that allowed corporations to sue states and indeed sue, in some levels, local authorities and other groups around the policies they made. So TTIP had a huge response and controversy, and for a long time TTIP was the trade deal between Europe and the United States, and there was a lot of controversy around it. And meanwhile CETA sneaked under the radar for quite a while. CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Europe and Canada. And CETA contained some of the worst elements of these new generation trade deals and a few new, brand new, terrible elements that were added in. And I'm sure some of you know this, so I'll only touch on them briefly, but if there's any that we want to discuss more, I'm very happy to as well. So some of the elements in the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement that are very concerning, in that trade agreement between Europe and Canada. One was a new kind of regulatory cooperation. What they call, which sounds lovely, regulatory cooperation, but what it did was it got rid of a really key principle which has been there in Europe for years and years, which was the precautionary principle. The idea that in Europe you don't introduce a measure if it may cause damage, if it may cause environmental damage, if it may risk health, if it may have, it's a precautionary measure. And the regulatory cooperation that is being brought in under CETA instead goes to the perspective where you have to prove that damage is being done. You have to have a huge body of scientific evidence and the caseload, and in fact the bad results of the damage of, say, a health measure or an environmental measure. You have to have that evidence before you can restrict it. So that's a very serious, in terms of identifying new health risks or new environmental issues, that's a really big problem with it. It also has the ratchet clause, which is that basically if you have a public service and you privatize it, it's almost like a ratchet, it moves one way. It's very, very hard to have a service that has been privatized become public again. That's another very serious concern. And one of the unique elements about the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Europe and Canada, a really experimental measure that they brought in, was that it would be what they called a negative list system. So normally if you're negotiating a trade agreement, or of any kind, historically, Europe would put on the table what it wants to trade in, Canada would put on the table. You would have what they call a positive list system. You say, let's trade on, sugar, and let's trade on certain health services, and let's trade on, dairy, or whatever it might be. The negative list system meant that for the very first time, everything is automatically on the table except what you specifically take off the table. And depressingly, Ireland had a very short list of, I think, 11 items that it took off the table. So for, what it meant, what that really is a note for the future where almost you're saying any area of commercial business, anything that comes up is going to be automatically covered by this trade agreement. Even future areas, we don't know what the industries of the future might be, but that they're automatically included. So that's a really unusual element of the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. But of course, the piece that most people would have been very, very concerned, the kind of high profile part in these new trade agreements, and in the CETA one in particular, is what has been called investor-state dispute settlements. So these are the corporate courts or investor courts, which have been discussed quite a lot. And investor courts, an investor-state dispute settlement, has been used right around the world by corporations suing countries when they bring in a public law or a regulation which damages, which the company can say is going to impact on their profits. And not just on their current profits, but on the future profits they expected to make. So that's a really extraordinary thing. So, for example, they can then go to these corporate courts, investor-state dispute settlements, but they've got a new name under CETA, which is ICS, Investor Court System. And a corporation can say, maybe to give an example is the easiest, for example, a company called Lone Pine, when in Canada, and Canada is the country which has had the most cases taken against it of any country. So, for example, when Montreal decided to place a moratorium on fracking, they decided to say no more fracking for 3 years because we want to investigate the environmental impacts. A company called Lone Pine sued Montreal under the investor-state dispute mechanisms for $25 million. Because they said, during these 3 years, we expected to make $25 million worth of profit, and because you have a moratorium, you're stopping us making those profits. So that kind of gives a flavour of what those cases can look like. And in many other parts of the world, including, especially in South, Mercosur was mentioned, Argentina and Ecuador, the cases have gone into the hundreds of millions. So these kinds of cases have a very negative effect on policymakers. And I say this as a policymaker because I know that if we're trying to bring rules through, bring in new good policies to protect maybe workers' rights, or policies to improve environmental protection, or policies to kind of protect health rights, if it's going to come with this, unknown price tag of a potential case from a company, that's going to have a chilling effect. And for a country to take a case, for a country, if they are sued, if Ireland was sued or if Canada's been sued, even to contest a case, so even to pay for the lawyers if a case is taken against you, is estimated, and this is by from Corporate Watch Europe, they say it costs approximately $5 million just to for a country to turn up in court and when a corporation sues it. So even that $5 million cost of going through the court case process is in itself a disincentive for good measures and policy measures. And I think there's so many areas where civil society, and I'm the Civil Engagement Senator, has campaigned and pushed for improvements to laws. And be it that you're passionate about workers' rights, be it passionate about areas like home care regulation, for example. We have big Canadian companies operating in the area of home care, and there's a real lack of regulation in that area. Be it health concerns, be it environmental concerns, be it workers' rights concerns, or any other area. It's really important that civil society and democracy and is able to mobilise and demand better laws in this area, and that we as legislators and politicians are able to respond to that civil society demand without having this chilling effect of the danger of a corporate lawsuit. So that's kind of the context, and I'll just move a little bit very quickly into my time check, I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to move into kind of where we are on CETA now. So because of my concerns on CETA, last year, was it last year? The year before, in fact, it was my very first private member's business slot in the Seanad. I brought forward a motion against the provisional application of CETA. And very unexpectedly, my motion was successful. It was a motion in the Seanad, however, and was overturned by the government and ignored by the government. And they did go on to sign up to provisional application of CETA. But it's something that's really important to note, that while CETA, and that's the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Europe and Canada, while it is being provisionally applied, it's not yet ratified. So for a long time we've been told the ship has sailed, it's too late to do anything. It's actually, we've been told that consistently, and it's constantly not been too late. So while it's been signed up to, it needs to be ratified. It means that every parliament across Europe has to agree to make this into full law, the CETA trade agreement. And until every country in Europe and every parliament has ratified it, the investor court part of it, the corporate court element, doesn't come into effect. So at the moment we have a situation where the trade is happening under CETA, then, and for those who want trade, that's, some of that form of trade. So 90% of the agreement is happening, but the investor court element is not happening and won't happen until all the countries have ratified it. And in the meantime, there have been a series of very high-profile European court cases at the very highest court in Europe, which is the European Court of Justice. There was a case a year ago. There are 3 big rulings that are very significant. One is the European Court of Justice ruled that every country had to ratify. That's why we're on that ratification. That was one. Secondly, the European Court of Justice ruled that the European Commission were wrong to ignore a petition that was signed by 2 million citizens from all across Europe and countries right across Europe who said, we don't like the terms on CETA, we don't like the investor court system, we want you to reconsider it. And the European Commission at the time said, we're going to ignore your petition, it's too late, we can't reopen the negotiations. And the European Court of Justice said, no, you're wrong, you could have reopened the negotiations. The third very, very important ruling just happened last week. And that ruling, or 2 weeks ago now, and in that ruling, the European Court of Justice ruled that a similar investor-state dispute mechanism, a case between Slovakia and the Netherlands, whereby a company from the Netherlands was asking Slovakia to pay a very big compensation under an ISDS court case. They ruled what they call BIT, which is, it's basically, these are kind of cases within Europe, bilateral investment treaties. So it's the same kind of thing of this investor court, corporate court. And the European Court of Justice ruled that that was incompatible with European law. So we have a very, very significant, it was one of the first times that the European Court of Justice has said that an investor-state court, because it's floating in space, it's separate from European courts and laws, does not stand up under European law. Now we're waiting for a ruling on probably the most important case, and that is because Belgium has asked the European Court of Justice to rule on whether the new investor court system that's in CETA is compatible with European law or not. And we're waiting for that case. So one of the most important things which I'm trying to do politically, and we need to kind of keep doing, is to say Ireland certainly shouldn't be ratifying while we're waiting to hear if the thing that we're ratifying is even legal. So there's a big question mark hanging there. And that's going to be a really, really significant moment. And in the meantime, civil society is continuing to mobilise and organise. The European courts of the judges, the German judges are saying that they don't like the systems. And it's a small reason, I don't want to go into too much, but one of the big problems with the investor courts, it's not just the big blank cheque compensation that they can give, but it's that the lawyers who are in investor courts are only experts in contract law. They don't know anything about constitutional law, human rights law, and things. So at the moment, when we don't have ratification, if a company has a problem, they'll have to battle it out in a national court. And that national court will be looking at corporate law, it'll be looking at contract law, but it'll also be looking at things like human rights law. It'll be balancing, like a proper court does, all the elements of the law and how they all relate to a case. So I think that's a lot better. Now I won't go there's lots happening, but it is an exciting moment. And the other one thing I just wanted to say, and maybe to finish, and I've only got, 1 minute left. Why this is important now, partly because of these rulings, but also because we're at a key point now of Brexit. And basically Europe is about to negotiate another very, very important trade deal. And we really need to, I think, get to the point where even those who were in favour of CETA, for example, or against it, where we get to a point now where we say, these are toxic elements, these investor court systems, which ruin trade deals, which stop them from working properly, and which in many cases stop them from happening. So even if you were in favour of, in terms of Brexit, we have to say, will investor court systems be included in the new trade deal between Europe and the UK? If they're included, it makes it much less likely that that trade deal is going to pass. So if you even want there to be trade between the UK and Europe in the future, which Ireland certainly does, you shouldn't be pushing for these investor court systems to be in there, as well as the fact that they may be illegal. So even on a very pragmatic level, there's reasons not to do it. But the other discussion that we really need to have in Europe is to say, The new generation trade deal was invented by corporations to suit their interests. What would a new generation trade deal look like? Trade deals which take out the toxic elements that only benefit a very few corporations, but would actually really work to ensure positive international trade that benefited everybody. And we need to have a new model ready to go, so that when we find the old model that has served us very badly is found to be illegal, we're ready with an alternative trade mandate. And in the 1990s, there was a really strong movement called an alternative trade mandate for Europe. And I'm hoping that we can revive that and have that back again and put forward a model of positive, constructive trade based on equality and development for all. So anyway, there we go. And I'm sure we can come to any of the details again. Thank you.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Thanks to John and Barry for inviting us all down, giving us the opportunity to impart with a little bit of knowledge, if we can. I'm here to speak to you in the first instance in relation to banking, the banking sector, and the need for and why we need to introduce public and community banking into Ireland. And the more I study about banking, I suppose, just to give you a little bit of background, I should say where I'm coming from. I am over 40 years in business in Ireland. I've always been involved in small business, and we've had many a clash with global corporations. And we'll talk about that maybe in the second session later on, when I'm going to talk a little bit about the dysfunctionality of our present political system, legal corruption, capture, all that, because it has a huge effect on everything that we're all talking about here. But just to begin with, I might let you know what a few people that know a lot more about banking than I do have said in the past. Thomas Jefferson said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies." And Henry Ford of all said, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." John Adams, US founding father and vice president and second president of the United States, said, "There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword and the other is by debt." So I suppose that's a little bit of a background to what I'm going to say to you. I joined the Public Banking Forum of Ireland, of which Jerry Duddy here, who's I'm sure known to most of you, was a founding member, along with James Miller and many, many other excellent people. And I suppose the culmination of our work was March last year. Actually, the 28th of March last year, we launched our document, Creating Ireland's Alternative Banking Force. We launched it on the same day as we presented to the Department of Finance. And just because of our lobbying and lobbying from various other groups, this present government included public and community banking in the programme for government. And arising from that, the Department of Finance and the Department of Rural Affairs set up a joint consultation in relation to the feasibility of introducing such a model. We presented to the department on the 28th of March, and I'd say it was fair to say our reception was reasonably hostile. I don't think the department have any intention of considering or recommending that we change our banking system. But to put things in perspective, people probably look at the Irish banking system and say, well, that's it, that's how a banking system works. But the Irish model, in the Irish model, we have 95% of our banking is controlled by 2.5 pillar banks, AIB, Bank of Ireland, and to a lesser extent Ulster and maybe Permanent TSB. And they, as we know, they went spectacularly bust back about 10 years ago and destroyed the socio-economic fabric of our country, and we're still recovering from it. I was talking to somebody today about the promissory notes that were signed. There's still 15 or 16 billion in promissory notes that we are burning every single year. Last year we burnt 4 billion. Now, to put that in context, it's costing 1.2 billion apparently to build a National Children's Hospital. So we could have 3 National Children's Hospitals for what we burnt last year, still paying our way out of the bank bust. But there is a different way. different way of doing things entirely. And I'm going to just talk about the German model, the German community and public banking model, and about the German economy, because we all think that Germany is about Volkswagen and Audi and Mercedes and Deutsche Bank and all of that, but it's not. It's actually rather different than our economy. KfW, which is a German state bank, produced figures in October 2015. And there are 3.7 million small and medium enterprises forming the backbone of the German economy. These represent 99.95% of all companies, and 87% have a turnover of less than 1 million. Think about it. Germany is made up of micro enterprises and SMEs. That's what drives the German economy, which is the 4th largest economy in the world and by far Europe's largest economy. Now, the pillar banks in Germany, the AIBs and Bank of Ireland's of Germany, say Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, etc., have 12.5% of the German market. Sorry, are you not hearing me? Too far away. Have 12.5%. The pillar banks in Germany have 12.5% of the market. The public banks, the Sparkassen banks, the community banks have 70% of the German market. And as of today, if you want to get a mortgage in Germany, you can get a 30-year mortgage fixed at 1.1% for 10 years. You can get a business loan for as little as 1%, depending on your credit rating, 2%, and really maxing out at 3%, you can get a business loan. In Ireland, it's very, very difficult to get any sort of a loan. And when you go looking for business loans in Ireland, you're invariably told you can't get this type of a loan and that type of a loan, to such an extent that I know a lot of business people and small farmers that are paying up to 15% on overdrafts. Well, a lot of them should be loans and business loans. But how can this nation of ours and our indigenous economy compete with France and Germany when we're paying up to 4 and 5 times the interest rates? Everybody says we're nominally paying double the interest rates, but in reality we're paying a lot more. And you know, people say, I heard Seanad Ryan, she's a consumer journalist, she was on the radio yesterday, and she was, oh, but sure the Irish banks have to charge more because there's more people losing their houses and this, that and the other. I mean, that's rubbish. What we're doing in Ireland is the banks have all coordinated the increasing interest rates. That's why. The banks are basically fixing interest rates at artificially high prices. The government, ourselves, control these banks, and we do nothing about it. So when the Irish banks all went bust and we had the bailout, we had the ECB were involved, the Commission were involved, Irish government were involved. And they all agreed that this was state aid, and more than likely the aid we were giving these banks was illegal state aid. But the banks were very important. They had to be kept in business. So there was a prerequisite. We would have to introduce competition into the Irish market. But instead of introducing competition, we lost Irish Nationwide, we lost Bank of Scotland, we lost ACC Bank, we lost ICC, we lost EBS, all gone. So now we just literally have 2.5 pillar banks. We've come along and, you know, people from all over the country, the Public Banking Forum is, you know, people from all over the country, we work very hard, we talk to politicians, but we just can't seem to get any traction. And the reason I believe, I just read a quote from Professor Steve Keen. I was going to leave it to the latter bit when I'm saying it, but Steve Keen is an expert on banking, he's an American, and he has this to say: we have to break that political nexus. It's false, because the reality is finance is a cost of doing business. It's not a profit centre. Finance, of course, has to make a profit in its own right to be viable. You need a financially successful, profitable banking sector, but you don't need one that's taken 30 and 40% of the profits of the economy, because at that level it's actually siphoning off money being generated in the real production of the industrial sector, the agricultural sector and the mineral sector. Ultimately, the financial sector should be the servant of the rest of the economy, not the master. But at the moment, it's the master of not just the economy, but of the politicians as well. So to break the nexus, we need a complete political shift. Now, the interesting thing in Ireland is that we actually have alternatives. We have the credit union movement, and we have the post office movement. They're in every town and village, practically every town and village all around the country. They have people that are informed, that know the local markets. The infrastructure is there, the computer systems are there. But the government has refused to allow the post offices to get involved in real banking. The post offices could, for example, create credit. They could do mortgages for first-time buyers. Equally, the credit unions can. But government has its foot on the credit unions for decades. And we have talked to credit unions, we talked to the post office people. They're all very keen to get out there and get into the real banking market. And it's our view that if we can set up, which is our proposal, we want to set up 10 public banks around the country. But we want the public banks to do all their business, all their front of house business, through the credit unions and through the post offices. That's a good plan. So why aren't the government listening to us? Alternatively, the post offices, we could follow the Kiwi Bank model. They had a post bank in New Zealand for about 150 years. And they suddenly then decided, the government decided they were going to corporatise it and make it profit maximising, and which they did. And the next thing was they sold it to Australian New Zealand Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world. So New Zealand ended up just with pillar banks. But they saw the error of their ways, and back in 2002 or 2003, I think it was, they set up the new Kiwi Bank. And in the few years, the 15 odd years since then, the Kiwi Bank has taken 20%. The Kiwi Bank now has 20% of the New Zealand banking market. Now, in Ireland, we could easily do that with our post offices. We could set up the Kiwi Bank equivalent in Ireland, and hopefully over a period of 15 years, they will get 20% of the market. So that still leaves the pillar banks with 80%, astronomical amount of dominance. But this is where the public banks come in. The public banks can come in and they can work alongside the credit unions to create a full banking service, which again can take 25 or 30% of the market, which still leaves the pillar banks, would leave the pillar banks with 50% of the market. And don't forget, in Germany, the pillar banks have only got 12.5% of the market. So it seems like, it seems so easy to do, or why can't we do it? But there's huge resistance by the pillar banks. They have us captured as customers, and they're charging us, 2 and 3, 4 times what they should be charging, and we have alternatives available. And it's my belief, and Alice Mary, I'm not a lawyer like you or anything like that, but I do a lot of work in the area of competition law and enforcement, competition economics. And the restrictions that the government, through the central bank, are placing on credit unions are clear breaches of Irish competition law and European competition law. They're applying dissimilar terms and conditions to similar transactions. And, I believe somebody has to go to Europe with it. The credit unions are a bit afraid. They're afraid of the cost of law. The post offices are owned and controlled by the state anyway, so their hands are tied. And just, I think one last thing I should point out is about credit creation. This here, if anyone knows it, it's a copy of the Irish Constitution, and most of us don't read it. But in the directive principles are not the Constitution proper, but they're the principles that our legislature have a duty to enshrine in bringing in legislation. So Article 45. Article 45.2, that the ownership and control of the material resources of the community may be so distributed amongst private individuals and the various classes as best to subserve the common good. And subsection 3, that especially the operation of free competition shall not be allowed so to develop as to result in the concentration of the ownership or control of essential commodities in a few individuals to the common detriment. But it goes further. Subsection 4, that in what pertains to the control of credit, the constant and predominant aim shall be the welfare of the people as a whole. So our Constitution tells us what to do with credit, yet we have given private banks a monopoly in the creation of credit. The post offices could do it, the public banks could do it. But our system is favouring, it's it's a parasite. We have a parasitic banking system, and with the help of God and all of you and all of us, we'll eventually get some change. I'm not hugely optimistic about the outcome of the current report from the Department of Finance and Rural Affairs, but we'll wait and see. So thank you all very much.
Thanks again, John, for this opportunity to come here and address you. My second topic is genetically modified organisms and glyphosate. And most GM crops that are grown in the Americas, both north and south. We don't grow them in this country at all, except in Oak Park in Carlow by Chagas. They're doing research on blight-free potato, but I'm not sure how successful it is. But I'd rather they didn't do the experiments here, because I'd rather declare this country a GM-free zone. And because I think, as a result of surveys done, 60% of European consumers do not want to consume GM crops, despite the fact that they are, unfortunately, through processed food, consuming some GM products. And that was brought to light by a German university when they done some experiments on residues of glyphosate in urine in the month of December, when there was no gardeners or anybody spraying the crops or farmers out. And we as farmers have been told from the word go by the Farmers Journal that glyphosate was a fantastic thing, and as it was kill Scotch grass. It was very hard to kill Scotch and very hard to control it. And in the 70s, I remember when glyphosate was introduced first, and you spray off a field and it got rid of the Scotch grass and you get on with growing crops. Absolutely fantastic product. And we were told it's biodegradable. It disappeared into the ground. That was it, gone. Safest thing, you could almost drink it, you know. And some people did try to drink it, unfortunately. And but the actual German university people discovered that we were urinating at 10 to 15 times the level that's allowable in drinking water. And where is it coming from? And the main source, apparently, from some evidence I've seen, is it's coming in sweeteners called high fructose corn syrup that's made from maize, that's genetically modified to withstand glyphosate, and it's usually sprayed about 3 times a year with it. And it stays in the crop, and it comes out in the sweetener. And the sweetener is high fructose corn syrup, was devised by the Japanese, and it's jokingly referred to as revenge for Hiroshima. It's one of the reasons that the Americans are very disease prone now, very obese, very a lot of type 2 diabetes and a lot of different diseases. And we're starting to follow them here, unfortunately, as the Irish have a sweet tooth. And in Europe, that we are heading there in a bad way towards becoming the most obese nation in Europe. And but what do we do about it? How do we counteract this? Farmers, as farmers, I represent farmers, we want a product that will kill Scotch grass. But unfortunately, the Farmers Journal made a lot of money out of advertising the fact to spray it before harvest. They had full-page ads. When you go to an impoverished country like in South America or whatever, there's massive billboards across the roads in some of these developing countries for glyphosate. And the main manufacturer was Monsanto, and who is now merging with Bayer. So they'll kill you with one thing and cure you with the next. It's a fantastic model for making money. And but as farmers, we want the product, but we don't want to consume it. And unfortunately, farmers have consumed it more than most, and which result now that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in the United States of America is known as farmers' lymphoma, because farmers are dying at a higher rate than any other sector of society in the United States. And unfortunately, in my part of the world, in Wexford, we have a lot of tillage farmers, and they spray a lot of glyphosate as well. And you know, a tillage farmer is nobody now unless he has a large, either a self-propelled sprayer or a massive trail sprayer to spray chemicals. That's a status symbol now. And to put the product in the boot of his car coming back from a merchant cost maybe 10,000 quid for different products that he'd spray on his crops. But you can consume organic crops that doesn't have any product applied to it at all, not even a chemical fertilizer. And the bad thing about it is that the farmer growing that crop can actually get €1,000 for his crop and 0 chemical inputs. And the guys with the big sprayers can spend €300 to €400 on chemical inputs and might make a profit if he's lucky at €50. So the logic is create demand, I think, and consume the products that are clear of these products if you want to stay healthy. In my opinion, it's essential that we first responsibility is to ourselves and our families. And my second responsibility is the farmer and to my members in ICSA, which are very, very, very positive about having a clean. They're producing invariably, they're livestock farmers and using very, very little chemicals or any other inputs. And they want our product marketed for grass-fed. If you go to a restaurant in the States, a grass-fed, grazed product commands a massive premium. And that's mostly what we produce here. We have, the few that are pushing the agenda. But unfortunately, I went to a Tillage Association meeting recently, and there was a lobbyist there, and he was a retired Department of Agriculture guy, and he was lobbying to try and get our politicians to approve genetically modified crops as the El Dorado for Irish farmers. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mentioned earlier about the lobbyists, the money that's available. But I think the consumers need to be aware of what they're consuming. And I think you've got a massive responsibility to yourselves and your families to consume products that are pure. Most Irish beef and lamb and all that is produced without any major chemicals at all, and that's why we don't want South American beef coming in here, because they used to eat beef 4 times a day in Argentina, and now they're eating soy. And unfortunately, genetically modified soy sprayed. They spray, aerial spray out, schoolyards and everything are sprayed, and there's kids born with deformities and everything. It's a horror story down there. And if you want to look on TV, look at TG Cahir and Furescale, and you'll see some of it won't be shown on RT mainstream. But the evidence is there. Just look it up. Look it up for your own health. But and support your local butchers and your local small shops and all, because they won't be there. The big supermarkets want to sell highly processed food, and lots of it. There's even supermarkets, when we go into Europe, there's even a large Carrefour supermarket lobbyist there lobbying to have meat-free months, because they want to sell just pure packaged processed food that has a shelf life. They won't have people running out in the snow to get a loaf of bread or a bottle of milk. They want just processed junk. And that's what's killing people. There's no doubt about it that the chemical levels in food. I actually went to the Food Safety Authority, 2 professors. I had a meeting with the 2 top people in the Food Safety Authority, and I asked them, could you tell me whether brown bread or white bread is safest to eat? And they said, sure, the brown bread would be safer. And I said, actually, the actual levels of chemical in the husk are supposed to be higher. Can you test it and tell me what's the safest thing to eat? They couldn't tell me, and they haven't wrote back to me either. They haven't told me exactly. So I think consumers are going to have to become very aware and ask, where's the provenance? Where's your product coming from? Ask the butcher, where's the meat coming from? Ask the hotelier, is this South American beef? Is this American beef? And or is it Irish? Is it locally grown? Who's the farmer? Is it organic? Is it, produced without GM product? I think that's the way forward, because as a country of farmers and small farmers and so on, I think the future is we could actually be the go-to destination, the spa destination of the world, the mecca for health. We have the cleanest climate here, with a few exceptions. We have the Atlantic air, and we have the grass. Grass produces the high CLAs, the omega-3s, with the right ratio of omegas that kills cancer. If we had enough beef and lamb, ditch the chicken. The chicken's coming in from South America and Asia, and they're using antibiotics there that's banned in the States in the 50s. Some of that chicken that's coming in is absolutely criminal. But listen, there's organic chicken, there's good chicken, there's locally produced chicken with provenance. You just check it out. And as for the same with the pork products, with CETA, there are pig farmers are going to be wiped out here as well, because there's massive pork operations in Canada, huge, mega. And down in one part of the States as well, it's absolute terrible driving through. There's North Carolina there. There's pig farms there. This place stinks to heaven. Same in Eastern Europe, in Poland, there's pig farms, and you just have to shut the windows of the car for 10 miles. And it's just criminal, the amount of concentration of pigs and slurry spraying and so on. The only thing is I don't think they don't use GM there, but they certainly, there's lots of antibiotics used. The biggest thing now going forward is is antibiotic resistance. When you get some disease or something, you depend on your doctor to go in. The chances of dying in the hospital is, so if you get this, it's not MRSA, but it's a new type of one, 40% chance of dying. That's the level now. They run out of antibiotics. And just because they're used in all this cheap imported product. So I think it's imperative that we reinforce ourselves with knowledge, because knowledge is power and information. You know, it's so important that we are conscious of what we consume. We got rid of the sugar industry here because we had a nice clean product, and now we're importing genetically modified foods and high fructose corn syrup using an acid and enzyme process developed by the Chinese as a joke, and it attacks your liver, and that's why people get fat. Monsanto's, or sorry, glyphosate I should say, on its own actually is quite toxic, but there's surfactants that go away to make it stick to the crop that are 100 times more toxic when they're combined with it. And now there's a second generation genetically modified crop introduced in the last couple of years in the States. They've 3 generations now. They've put the second one into stream the last 2 years. It's a mixture of, first of all, sorry, the first genetic modification generation was glyphosate resistant. The plant will grow without succumbing to glyphosate. All the weeds will die. You spray with it. But it also had a thing called a Bt toxin, which is, it's come from, I forget now, but it's bacterial or something, but it's pretty toxic. It'll kill any insect that'll land on it and drink any drop of water and that comes from it. It'll burst its stomach open. But then some people wonder why they get celiac disease and all sorts of irritable bowel syndromes. Now, these toxins are in your food. But the second generation is a step further than that. They use dicamba, which is kind of an out-of-date. They run out of ideas. They stumble across these things. These scientists are bluffers. Most of them don't develop them. They stumble across glyphosate, actually. It was a thing put together to clean steam boilers and power stations, and they just discovered it burnt grass. So they said it's a good idea to give it to farmers and spray it on crops. But the second generation is dicamba additive to it, because some of the weeds weren't dying with the glyphosate, and now they'll die with the dicamba. But the problem with the dicamba is if it dries off within 2 or 3 days, and it'll blow 10 miles and it'll destroy crops 10 miles away, say apples or some other crop. So there's massive law cases in the States about that at the minute. But wait till you hear the 3rd generation one. That's got dicamba, and it's got 2,4-D, Agent Orange. You know, it's got the triple whammy, and they have a crop developed that will withstand those triple whammy. But you know, it's what will they be putting in your food then, you know. So look, we want, as farmers, we want products that work, but we don't want to have them in the food chain. We don't want to spray them pre-harvest. They have been sprayed. I sprayed it myself. I sprayed 20 acres pre-harvest when I didn't know this information. I thought it was a good idea to do it, and I 5 days later I harvested the crop and stored it, and it's lovely haylage from your horses and cattle and so on. And I gave it to the horses, and when the weather got bad, I said, "Better feed these horses this haylage to do the job." And the horses trashed around that bale with their feet. And I said, "Yes, buggers, I'll give you old cheap cattle silage now that, you know, this wasn't really suitable for horses," but they ate 95% of that, and they loved it. And but they wouldn't eat the stuff with glyphosate on it. And the glyphosate, of course, I was told by the Farmers Journal, of course, that this is the way to go and it'll disappear, it's biodegradable. I actually seen it in 2 years ago in this garden weed killer in Aldi, in New Ross. Glyphosate labelled as biodegradable 2 years ago. I said this is a food safety authority people at the time. I said, if you can buy it in the supermarket, you can put it on the tray. He said you shouldn't, you should pack it up first. I said, you mustn't be aware of modern shopping. You put everything up on the conveyor, you don't hide nothing in bags or anything. And so I could go on for another hour or two, but when I see friends with cancer, and I see farmers with high levels of Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancers and all these things, sometimes they mightn't have them, they might be operated on anyway, it's just on an exploratory method, you know, you don't know if you have it or not. Unfortunately, that's the situation. The Pfizer CEO has just got a raise. He's got a 60% raise there recently, the last few days. If you look up the news, he's got a raise. He's on, anyone guess how much he's on? He's nearly getting 30 million a year, you know. They'll soon have him on $1 million a week. They just don't want to, he's 65 years of age. They just don't want him going to another company. And Pfizer's biggest biggest money earners, a thing called Lipitor. And that's supposed to reduce your cholesterol. But it also reduces your libido. But our second biggest seller is Viagra. So you can, one will knock it back and the other will knock it up. So on that, I'll finish up, but I could go on. So just be aware of what you're consuming, who you're putting your trust in. Get your information, do your research. Don't take my word for it at all. Don't take my word for it at all. But do your research, be conscious of what you're eating. Eat healthy whole foods, eat grass-fed beef and lamb. You know, eat natural, perishable products. When you see a package with 20 ingredients on it, I'd suggest to run a mile. I'd leave all that stuff on the table, on the shelf or wherever, you know, but certainly, there's a lady who wants to ask a question.
How do you feel about the refusal of our government to label or to insist by law on the labelling of all foods, whether it has GMOs or not?
I would be totally in favour, because I would like to see all foods labelled as GMO. I'd like to see this country declared a GMO-free zone. I'd like to stop importing 500,000 tonnes of soya crop. And I'd like our farmers to get well paid for their product as a GMO-free product. There's no farmer here who's benefiting from GMO at all. And there is companies and there is crop available. And Maersk and different big shipping companies will provide us with GMO-free soya. No problem at all if we go for it. But I've lobbied Minister Coveney in the past with little effect. I'm making a little bit more headway with Minister Creed. But I think consumers need to, you know, I think they need to stand up and be counted and demand that they want better food. And certainly the Irish farmers have been producing food. But instead, the globalisation thing wants us to compete with huge factory farms in the Americas, you know, and they just want to put us out of business. And then they want to have large dairy farms with 500,000 cows with very low animal welfare and men that will not last, you know, 4 or 5 years in New Zealand on a 700 cow farm, and you are fit for, you know, the arthritis clinic or the loony bin or both. Because I had a New Zealand guy working for me for a few years, and he educated me about, you know, these large dairy farms in New Zealand that were they weren't alone ecological disaster or an economic disaster, but there were psychological warfare on people as well. Like, it was just crazy. But 4 years was the maximum time that a farmer could work on one of those farms. He had to go live in the city then because he was just physically or mentally wrecked or both. So that information has not been passed back to farmers, and I believe it should be. And farmers should be told the truth. Unfortunately, there's massive vested interests. The farming press here has massive vested interests in selling advertising. Unfortunately, there's Agriland and all that doesn't, and they tell the truth and they tell it very, you know, they tell it as it is. But unfortunately, there's massive money goes into advertising, and the farmers are not being told the truth, and the consumers are certainly not being told the truth. And I think the consumers need to assert themselves and demand and pay for proper product. Be aware, it's there, product is there, just go get it. Don't be buying the fancy advertised stuff that's on the telly, because if it's advertised, it's not pure. All the good pure foods are not advertised at all. They don't have to be, because people will buy them anyway. And you know, you'll never see a box of cornflakes on the outside of a supermarket. It'll always be a steak and a farmer in a field of grass with a cow or something like that, and milk. But it won't be cornflakes. But they get you in there to get the perishables, as it were, and then they'll try and load you up with all sorts of things that you probably shouldn't buy at all. Dennis, the back.
Sorry, if we could just hold the questions until the end.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for listening to me and enduring it. But look, it's up to you people. I certainly have to represent my farmers. We want product that will kill the weeds, but we do not want to put it in the food chain. We want to get proper price. We don't want to be competing with imported junk. And I think we also want to live healthy, long lives. And I'd like my members to be aware of that too, that when I took up this position of president, that I didn't want to bury any of them. Unfortunately, I haven't so far, and I'm in there for another 2 years now, and I hope the same continues on, because life is fickle and precious, and I think we need to be aware. The most important thing we do every day is eat 2 or 3 meals a day, and the most important person in everybody's life is a farmer that produces that food. It's not the doctor, Because when you go to the doctor, he's only guessing. And doctors differ and patients die. So thank you very much.
So I know everybody's getting ready and wanting to ask questions again, so I'm going to try and be not too long on my second topic. My second topic, I was asked to talk about PESCO. That's the Permanent Structured Cooperation on Peace and on Security and Defence. It's a new military alliance that Ireland and a number of other European countries, and most other European countries, but not all, have signed up to. And I wanted to first say, I don't necessarily agree with the poster. The poster says we're in an EU army now, what next? We're not in an EU army next yet. There are those who would perhaps like us to be, very openly, even, I think Juncker, who's the head of the European Commission at the moment, has said he's interested in that idea, and a European defence person has said, Federica Mogherini has said she would like that as well, but we're not there yet, and it's very important that we don't give ground, because there's a few still lines where we really need to fight and battle, and we need to hold on to those spaces, because it's a classic thing you see in politics where people say, it'll never happen, it's too late, it's already happened. And that kind of gets told to you. So we were told for a long time what we've been seeing is a slipping agenda, where people have been easing out the military agenda bit by bit. It started with Irish troops participating in European training and battle groups. So previously we've had a very strong and I think very proud history in Ireland in areas like peacekeeping with the UN. And Ireland has had a very strong tradition of neutrality, and 80% of the public, we know, support neutrality. But we've taken part in peacekeeping with the United Nations, in peace building, in that kind of cooperation. But there began to be a slippage. So suddenly we were doing new kind of training missions that were battle groups. Last summer, we switched from, I think, something that many of us would have been very, very proud of, which was the incredible work that our Irish Navy were doing in the Mediterranean in terms of rescuing humans and rescuing people. And we switched from our direct work in that to instead joining up with Operation Sophia, which was a European joint effort. And at the time, and this is a quote from the Minister for Defence, Minister Keogh, he said, and this is his words, "Transferring to Operation Sophia will result in the redeployment of Irish naval service vessels from primarily humanitarian search and rescue operations to primarily security and interception operations." So it was a shift away from that humanitarian focus, which had been the core of Ireland's contribution. And as an example of how important what we had been doing had been, was that Ireland having one ship at any time, and it was sometimes the Etna and sometimes the Beckett, and it changed, saved 17,500 lives. Operation Sophia, the previous to us joining it, over the same period, would have had 5 ships at any given time approximately, and they saved 32,000 lives. So 5 times as many ships, only twice as many people saved. And that is because its priority was not humanitarian rescue. So that's a really, when I think we talked, and I just wanted to say I really was moved by the other speakers, because I do think it's so important. I am a very proud credit union member, and I also was very struck by what you said in terms of that area of cooperation, in terms of the environmental cooperation, because I think we're seeing a lot of cooperation now in terms of sustainability between the farming, between those in farming who wanted to be sustainable and those in the environmental movement, and in terms of even areas like the pollinator plan. But this is another area which is about lives and lives saved. So there's a real cost there. In PESCO, I had raised it in the autumn. I didn't get proper answers, and then it was produced in the last week before the Christmas break, on the last day of the Dáil. They rushed through Ireland signing up to PESCO. That's Permanent Structured Cooperation on Security and Defence. And there's been a lot of, it's the same, don't worry, it's more or less the same thing, it's just peacekeeping and we're getting better at it. But the lie is in the fact that the PESCO notification document does not contain the word peace, peacekeeping, or peace building even once. In a very, very lengthy document, it does contain a lot of references to NATO, It contains one reference to the UN, which I think the Minister quoted about 5 times, but it was the same one quote going round and round, because really what this does, PESCO sets up that all of those countries who've signed up, including Ireland, are committing to a constant increase in military spending, to increased military cooperation. We're told that that will be on a case-by-case basis, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute, and to a kind of new agenda of increased militarisation. In terms of the case-by-case basis, we're told that each mission that Ireland joins up with under PESCO will be, a decision under the triple lock, which is, of course, that the Cabinet has to decide, the Dáil has to decide, and that there needs to be a UN mandate. But that may be for where we send our troops. But it's a bit of a slippage there. But the huge, new and very dangerous area, I believe, under PESCO is the procurement, the spending on military. That's what's very different, and that's something incredibly new for Ireland at the moment on it. The goal is to increase, that you will year on year increase military spending, but there's no guarantee that that will go, for example, to frontline army staff or navy staff, who we know that many of those who serve in the Irish Army are living on very low wages and with very poor conditions. But there's no guarantee that the money will go to them. And and many have suggested that, in fact, the wages and conditions for those who are in the Army and in the Navy have been run down so as to help to build support for PESCO. But a lot of the military funding that comes under PESCO will have to go, and it's designated under PESCO, will be going to development of and purchase of new military hardware, new military software, new military equipment. And in that, we're looking for the very first time for Ireland, really properly, a joint procurement, which is where we will be investing in research and development of military weaponry and purchase of military weaponry with other countries who are not neutral countries. So just to give a sense of what that means, we don't know, and just to clarify, I asked, would that be under the triple lock? It won't be. They've, having initially refused to answer me, they did tell me it won't be. So we don't know how we can be sure that the Irish public money that is spent on military hardware and military equipment, we don't know how that's going to be used by the countries who we buy it with. So, for example, will we be able to see the contracts? Will the military equipment which we buy be used under a UN mandate? We know that Germany is in NATO and has troops on the ground in Afghanistan. So if we're purchasing with them, there's every likelihood it will be used there. We know that Austria, just last year, sent armoured tanks to the border with Italy to be used against migrants if they were to cross over from Italy. Again, if we engage in joint military procurement contracts with Austria, we don't know how those weapons or how that military hardware will be used, and will it be used to breach human rights. We also know that a lot of European countries have very different histories in terms of their relationship. Many of them still have relationships with colonies and former colonies. And indeed, there's a record of them testing weaponry on former colonies. So there's a huge question mark over what we, as Irish citizens, might be making possible. And there's been an absolute lack of debate about it. Even in the European Union, in the Parliament, they've been debating, for example, should European public money be used to purchase what they call swarm technology, where you have large amounts of automated drones who have the potential to really engage in very large-scale automated killing. Is that something that we will or won't be involved in? There's a huge number of questions, and there's an absolute lack of transparency as to how our public monies might be spent in that regard. But there's a second danger as well in relation to this whole question of where it's coming from. This is where it comes to the corporate lobby as well. There are a lot of companies in Ireland. We don't currently have a very large military industrial complex, but there are companies in Ireland who would like to be part of a military-industrial complex. There are companies who would like to be getting in to a larger degree on the European military action. And a lot of the pressure and push around this, we have to see, is it coming from there? Companies, for example, and there's been a very blurry line. For example, we've had companies in Cork who produce ships which can be used in policing or in military purposes, who have promotional videos that feature the Irish Navy. We've had Irish Navy ships taken to arms trade fairs in other parts of the world as a promotional example. And the reason this is important was, I mean, people focus a lot on neutrality, and it is the key. It is the crucial element. And it's very significant that now that PESCO is under the radar, we have now seen Fine Gael MEPs just a couple of weeks ago come out openly and say that they want to look at maybe getting rid of neutrality altogether. That was a few weeks ago, and that's a very, very dangerous slippery slope. But what we lose in terms of involvement with PESCO or involvement with this kind of European military activity is not just, it's not just a threat to our neutrality, it's a threat to Ireland's peace-building role. And Ireland has an incredible peace-building role, and actually it has an incredible disarmament role, and specifically, and I just wanted to quote one thing very quickly. This is from our Department of Foreign Affairs website. Achieving a world free of nuclear weapons, promoting disarmament of conventional weapons and arms control are priorities for Ireland. Ireland recognises that the spread of weapons of all kind fuels conflict, contributes to human rights abuses and hinders development. So that's our policy in the area of disarmament, and yet at the same time we're signing up to a year-on-year increase in military spending. And what our record in disarmament has meant is that Ireland has, to kind of use unfortunately violent image, punched very far above its weight internationally. It is our neutrality and our peace building and our disarmament work that has given us huge international credibility. It was Frank Aiken, who was one of Ireland's first ever ministers for foreign affairs, who initiated and was the first to sign the global nuclear disarmament, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That was an initiative of Ireland. And I was lucky enough to be there. I worked for Trócaire at the time, when Ireland helped to broker a global ban on cluster bombs, which are basically landmines from the sky. And Ireland, in Croke Park, with representatives from all over the world, was the country that could push a global ban on those absolutely brutal weapons over the line, partly because we didn't have a military-industrial complex holding us back, pulling political levers, and we were able to act as a genuine, honest broker. That's what we are, and of course, it was Ireland and our neutrality that meant that it was, an Irish representative, and this is why our neutrality works for Europe. When Europe needed to send somebody to the peace talks in Colombia, they sent Eamon Gilmore from Ireland, because Ireland had a credibility that no other European country could offer in that space. So there is a huge amount we have to lose by basically becoming, and I think we can be the beacon around disarmament at a very, very hawkish time in global politics, where we are seeing saber rattling right across the world happening. We're seeing it in Russia, we're seeing it in many of the former Eastern European countries now, we're seeing it in America. We have a dangerous hawkish time, and the world needs honest brokers and voices for peace, something Ireland has always been. Instead, we're swapping that role for a very minor role in a European military machine. And I think we kind of need to step up and push on that. So that's why I'm saying we're not part of an EU army, and we do need to fight, and we need to assert, because the government are producing ever narrower definitions of what neutrality means. You can actually trace, they're still using the word because it matters to the public, but they're chipping away at its meaning. So I think we as the public, and indeed those of us in politics and those of us with any platform at all, need to start asserting what we mean by an active, constructive neutrality in the world and pushing back on that. And just a last point I would say on the is increased military spending doesn't just come at a cost in terms of human rights, it doesn't just come at a cost, it will come at a cost in terms of public investment in other areas. And we're already seeing that. This is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I was very struck by it. The Tory Islanders, I don't know if many of you are familiar at the moment that the Tory Islanders have a campaign because they've been given, I think the Queen of Arran, or a boat from years ago. I went over as a child to the Aran Islands on this boat. Tory Islanders have been given an old, outdated, dangerous boat to cross Tory Sound. Meanwhile, millions have now been apportioned for new Navy ships. And what we will begin to see again and again, and I lived in America for years, we don't want Ireland to go that route where every time we're regretting the massive military spend and wondering how we can, shave off some small percentage of it to fund society and a society that functions. So I guess we need to get in there early and press back. So again, looking forward to your discussions, and sorry for keeping you so long because I know you all have contributions to make as well. Thank you very much.
Okay. Very interesting talks from everybody. I'm looking at both Alice Mary and Pat, and even the stuff I've said. And being 40 years in business in Ireland, I had to take the Dáil Éireann way back in the 90s to try and see about getting rights of small business. And I've struggled with what you might call lobbying, although I understand if you're a lobbyist, you're getting paid. I've never got paid for any of my work, but we'll call it lobbying. And I'm a long-time member of Transparency International, and did a report, National Integrity Systems, did a report on Ireland in 2012. And I think I might just start by saying what they found. They said that while international indicators suggest that Ireland does not have a serious problem with petty corruption, successive tribunals of inquiry over the past several decades have revealed near systemic levels of grand corruption in politics, government and business. The recent final report of a long-running corruption tribunal found endemic and systemic corruption in Irish political life and exposed corrupt and inappropriate payments from business people to politicians. The Mahon Tribunal said corruption affected every level of government in the decade up to the late 90s, from some holders of top ministerial office to many local councillors. It found that its existence was widely known and tolerated. While this corruption was occasionally investigated or subject to adverse comment, those involved operated with a justified sense of impunity and invincibility. And then Transparency International go on to describe legal corruption. And legal corruption takes many forms and includes cronyism, patronage and state capture, where powerful groups manipulate policy formation to serve their own interests rather than the public interest. And I think legal corruption is very easy in a small country, a small population. I actually believe that Ireland is the legal corruption capital of the world. And throughout the years, I just didn't know why you couldn't go in to a political party. I would go to people in Fine Gael, I would go to people in Fianna Fáil, I would go to people in Labour, myself and various other people that we'd be grouping together. And I remember on one occasion, and it's not really fair to pick out one party, but we went to Joe Costello in the Labour Party, a very fine man, a man I have a lot of respect for. Joe was horrified at the combined stories of corruption in business and politics that we informed him about. And he said to us over the meeting, he said, I'm taking this to the very top. So we didn't hear back from Joe for quite a while. And then I met him, maybe about 6-8 weeks later, I met Joe. And he sat me down for a coffee and he said, Seamus, he said, I brought this to the very top, but they wouldn't go there. More recently, a number of us, including Pat's organisation, lobbied on CETA, and we lobbied very hard, for example, with Fianna Fáil. We met Niall Collins, Eamon O'Keefe and There was a third TD there, just his name is escaping me. But we thought we did a good job. We thought we had them convinced about GMOs and about ISDS or ICS, whatever we like to call it. But they were gone. Didn't hear from them again. So I met Eamon O'Keefe at a public meeting there about maybe 6 weeks ago, and I just asked him afterwards, no secret, I said, what happened? You know, what happened with CETA and ISDS? And he said, Micheál Martin wouldn't go there. Now, if you look at, you go back to this whole thing about capture, because in my view, it's capture that is causing all the problems. The body politic is captured. The regulators are captured. The media are captured. And that's why you're not hearing what Pat had to say. You're not seeing that on prime time or on Tonight with Vincent Brown or whoever. All of these really important issues are not getting out into the public domain. And let's just talk about capture, because there's one little point I should have made about the banking, but this is just an example from the world of this globalized world that we've moved into. You know, when Ireland went to rebank, after the bust up, we went to rebank, and I forgot to make this point. We set up the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland, which was supposed to give loans out to small business, etc. But the Strategic Banking Corporation is simply a non-lender. It gets the funds in from the KfW in Germany and various other investors, and it on-loans the monies to, guess who? Mostly Bank of Ireland, AIB. There are a few very small people that take on lending, but it's mainly the pillar banks. Now, this is an incredible figure. The Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland are borrowing funds at 0.8%. And they're on lending those, AIB and Bank of Ireland are on lending those funds at 5%. That's an extraordinary margin. Normally in banking, if you're getting 1% or anywhere between 1% and 2% above cost of funds, you're doing really well. But wait for it. The loans that the pillar banks and the other on-lenders are making are 80% guaranteed by the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland. Now, what about that? I mean, I'd be very happy to take funds at 0.8% and lend them to you at 5% and have the people that's giving me the money guarantee me my money back, or 80% of it. I mean, that's capture. That is where the banks have captured the government. And when all this money could have gone into public banking, no, it's gone through the pillar banks. And most people in Ireland have a very bad record with the pillar banks, because their credit history has been damaged probably due to the behaviour of the pillar banks themselves. And again, like, even if you look at the Apple tax situation, and you know, the way we spend money, I mentioned earlier about the children's hospital is estimated to cost 1.2 billion. Well, it just happens that last year in Finland, they signed a contract for a new hospital, which is on the same lines, same scale as the Irish National Children's Hospital. The contract was signed for 300 million. But in Ireland, the latest estimate for our children's hospital is 1.2 billion. So I dread if we got our hands on the Apple's 13 billion plus interest 17 billion. And incidentally, you know, it's my view, and I think that the decision was very, very clear. It was right, the decision that the DG competition made. But in the aftermath of that decision, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour came out with statements that must have all used the same PR company. And they're now wasting our money in making this appeal to Brussels. I know Apple are appealing it in any case, so we still mightn't have it. But again, example of corporate capture. And here's a man from your own constituency here, and maybe you can explain this to me, because I cannot figure it out. Deputy Timmy Dooley, back at the Fianna Fáil Ardèche, announced that it was Fianna Fáil policy, his policy and Fianna Fáil policy, to bring in, if they get into government, to subsidise the print media. So now it appears that Fianna Fáil want to subsidise independent news and media, and probably news talk. I mean, all this media that's not non-social media, they want to subsidise it. I can't get my head around it. I've sent Timmy messages there over the weekend because I was conscious I was coming down here and I was looking for answers. So, admittedly, I understand he was away or he's in Brussels, but I have to apparently ring his office and make an appointment to see him. So, I'll do that in due course. And again, you know, I've been going through the Irish court system with a case against very large corporations in the cement sector, and I'm 22 years in court, and I haven't even got to the starting line. And Ireland, for example, it's illegal to use third-party funding. I've been offered funding by various funders abroad to help me to bring a case through the courts, but that's illegal, I can't do it. It's also illegal to sit down with your solicitor and say, well, look I'll give you 20% or I'll give you 30% or 50%, a contingency fee. You can't do that either. So again, the corporation wins. They can hold somebody like me, a small business person, 22 years in court and still haven't even reached the starting line. And that brings me to the regulators. And I've described them publicly in the past and will be in the future. I've had extensive dealings with the Competition Authority since its inception in 1991. I've had extensive dealings with the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement since its inception in 2001. And I'm watching the central bank and how it has behaved with the banks, even though I'm not directly involved. And I describe these regulators as bogus. They are there to protect the status quo. They're not there to protect you or me. And why? There's a problem. One word, culture. We have a culture in this country of greed. We have a culture of, corporatizing everything at the expense of people. And Pat has just been talking about food standards, and that one of the reports I did was a report on the beef sector a couple of years ago. And I did another one in relation to the bread sector. And I'm afraid we have huge, huge issues with bread and with what's going into bread. I'm not going to say too much here. It's almost 2 years since I finished it, but I have the information, and I would be concerned that we're eating very unhealthy food. Again, it has been brought to regulators' attention, but nothing has been done about it. So, and I would just, when we're on farming, I've had quite an interaction with the IFA over maybe the last 4 or 5 years on various things. And, to be perfectly honest, I say it, I don't know if there are any farmers in the audience, but as far as I'm concerned, the IFA is captured too. The IFA, and meet any of the members, they'll tell you they're very, very unhappy. I was at a meeting where the IFA met all the candidates for the last general election in Sligo. And it was amazing. A lot of farmers put up their hand and they were on about cartels. Certainly the report that we have done would suggest that the input costs to Irish farmers, like animal feedstuffs, fertilizers, veterinary pharmaceuticals, are artificially high. Why? I'm not going to say why, but I can guess. And these guys, these farmers asked, and when it came to the Labour candidate to answer the question, she was a sitting senator, she said, unfortunately there's nothing we can do about the cartels. Now, that to me is capture. So until we uncapture the regulators, until we uncapture the media, and until we knock some sense into Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, we're never ever going to make progress on any of these things that we're all talking about. So in a nutshell, that's all I have to say on capture and legal corruption. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions.
Just one quick question on the ISDS investor dispute mechanism. Surely that would have to go to an Irish referendum, because you would effectively be granting, the people would be granting sovereign power to an external court of whatever in Switzerland or something like that, with the power to actually award monetary amounts and money from the Irish people or taxpayer to corporate. And I saw that raised once, I think, was it a Sinn Féin guy raised it with Brian Hayes, and Brian Hayes was in like a shot to say, oh, absolutely no way, it's covered some other way, or something like that. But it looks very, very clear to me that the state is very, very exposed to this process on anything like fracking or like that. And it would have to, in my view, require the people to transfer the sovereign power to, and I'm just wondering how they're getting around that.
I think I can even answer the question that was just raised. Seamus, you, about 5 years ago, schooled me on Article 45 in Oberon, Newmarket and Fergus. And Article 45, the bit you didn't read out, the principles of social policy set forth in this article are intended for the general guidance of the Oireachtas. The application of these principles in the, in the making of laws shall be the care of the Oireachtas exclusively, and shall not be consignable to any court under any provision of the Constitution. Until language like that, and it's in 2 articles in the Constitution, until that is removed, we are joking ourselves. If you want to do something about that. And then when our elected representatives don't do what they're supposed to, they can't hide, because you can take them to court. That's the capture. Thank you.
Sorry, my apologies, I'm late in. I heard you mentioning bread and food there a moment ago. I'd just like to say, I was travelling through this country this last springtime and harvest time. And I found a dish here that even my own native place in Kildare, it was the first year that on my parents' farm there was never a grain of corn grown. And the farm, it's been in the family for nearly 200 years. And looking for food and for fodder down this side of the world, but they haven't got it up that side of the world because they're not growing the grain. It doesn't pay them to grow it anymore. It's imported from the Ukraine at 60 euros a tonne. We trade on Irish whiskey, that everything is Irish. How can you trade Irish whiskey if your barley is coming from the Ukraine? And that part of it. We don't grow anything in this country. We're not self-sufficient. We depend on the lorries to bring it in to Dublin port. We're going to starve one of the days. We only have 3 days' supply of food.
I'm a part of civil society, and I'm very involved in community and voluntary organisation for years. And you know what, I've listened to some great speakers. They're very well versed in what their subject matter is. Very important for me. And obviously being born in the countryside and stuff like that. I mean, the notion for me, when I live now in town, the notion, the knowledge that I hear that farmers are doing well and have done well over the last number of years, really, in terms of various subsidies they're getting and doing very well. And I'm trying to marry up that with consumers want change and consumers drive change. I mean, is that a fact? Do consumers drive change? I mean, the information on the ground for people like myself is very scarce, really. So that's a big issue that needs to be addressed. Information to the general public. Nearly impossible. Only if I come here tonight now, I wouldn't know half of what's going on there, you know, between Mary Alice and the chap from Wexford and the man on the finances there. You know, very interesting from that point of view. But as a guy from civil society and a consumer, you know, we're talking about food here and we talk about change. I mean, consumers do drive change, and we want prices down. And we're not going to put up, we're not going to pay top mark for meat or whatever food because it's dear, because maybe we don't have the money, we're on welfare maybe, or we're on low income. So it's kind of a balancing act. How do we balance that out?
Thank you very much. You're right. I mean, it's Matt Carthy from Sinn Féin who has talked particularly around the constitutional challenge. And I think it's a case, if we did have it bring in, I think it would be likely that a case would be taken. The defence that is used, or the argument is that they say, well, you're free to bring in any law you like, but you just have to pay compensation because it relates to the finances. So what they are arguing is that they're not interfering with the policies, but the Oireachtas are free to introduce their policies. It's just that it's going to come with this compensatory price tag. So that's, I'm saying, the argument that is given from the other side. I don't know that it stands up, but that's one of the pushback that they've given. But I think there's two key things in it. First of all, it's very clearly against the spirit that is there in terms of the Constitution, and it's also against the spirit of the European Union law as well. And that's something that the European Court of Justice is going to be challenging, but also that we need to challenge. But it is also against that question of current and future generations politically, in terms of being able to really genuinely influence and shape policy. It is a hostage to fortune. So I think it is against the spirit. Whether a case would succeed, I've heard different legal arguments back and forth, but it's definitely worth taking. But there was somebody else who was mentioning there are elements in our Constitution that where interpretations have been done. So one of the big ones, and it's not to drift into another topic, but it's been used a lot in relation to housing. We often hear that there's these duties for public policy and the social good, but then there are also the protection of private property within the Constitution. So again and again, the interpretation that's made when, for example, we try to bring in measures around housing and positive and constructive measures around social housing and housing as a social good, is that idea of private property rights and where does the balance go. So I think that there's a number of cases that need to be challenged in terms of how our Constitution is interpreted. And I think those measures that try to protect that space for public policy, social policy for the public good, we need to get more robust about trying to push those aspects of the Constitution and facing down any and being willing to take that through the courts if we need to. I think the other questions, a lot of them related back to the environment, but just in terms of your question, what you were saying about consumers and that, I really think there is, if we look to communities, like sustainable communities, where people can make a living out of farming, and where there's also other people who aren't in farming, but there's towns that can thrive and villages that can thrive. It is about recognising what Ireland might be able to do, and I do think there was a very strong point, and we look at things like in Galway, when you talked about a consumer demand, yes, there is a push around the cheaper good, but there's also a push around things like the Food on the Edge Festival. For example, the fact that, we've seen tillage farmers that have moved into things now, like, for example, like producing pumpkins, horticulture, higher value goods that, which really benefit from that Irish environment and a kind of a greener way of being produced and a more sustainable way of being produced. And so sometimes the change doesn't have to be, because the fact is Ireland, just the physical size of Ireland, will never be able to compete in the go big and go cheap levels with the vast farms that people mentioned, the Ukraine, and we have it, of course, in America as well. Where Ireland can offer something is in terms of, I think, sustainable products. And that's why things like making sure that our trade deals don't push down the dynamic and make it easier for cheaper, poor quality goods to flood the market is going to be really important. But I'm not the expert in this. I'll pass it over to somebody with lots more to say in that area.
Just on the food, there's different theories on it, and a lot of the current diet people are consuming is as a result of the work of one guy in America called Ansel Keys, and he was the guy given charge of the health of the Americans after the death of President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower was deemed to have, his arteries were pretty well clogged up, and supposedly fat in his arteries, and would result that Ansel Keys, who was actually a highly trained economist, not so much a nutritionist as an economist. He has a PhD in economics, I believe. And so to push for low-fat food, and would result that when you work on a low-fat diet, you're always hungry. And the fat contains the micronutrients that your body needs, and it also has a satiety, like you put butter on spuds, it's a meal in itself almost. The potatoes on their own won't work. But fat is probably one of the most important constituents. Fat and proteins are very, very important. The animal, as a farmer, I've studied nutrition over the years, and it's a continuous study because every animal disease or an animal's demise, or whether it thrives or not, depends on what it's eating. And it's really, I don't farm pigs, and I haven't ever, but it's down to a very fine art with pigs, because they measure the amount of feed, tons of feed in for tons of pigs out, and the quality of the pigs is measured also, how much conformation, fatness, and so on. So they have it down to a very fine art, and with the result that they have the micronutrients and the balance of the diet very precisely controlled. With cattle out grazing, it's a different story, and they don't need any supplementation at all if there's a mixed pasture. But when you get down to the monoculture, ryegrass only, and so on, and you don't have the legumes and so on, you have to supplement with other feeds and so on. So, to cut a long story short, really getting back to human and animal nutrition, like they're linked in lots of ways, and if you want the micronutrients, you eat a well-nourished animal, and that well-nourished animal is I'm very biased towards grass-fed animals, be it a goose or a cow or a bovine or a sheep ovine, and micronutrients are becoming less available in food. You can eat all the vegetables you like. Tomato now is the same as the amount of micronutrients in a tomato in the 1940s. You'd have to eat 8 tomatoes today. If you go into Google Earth and go down to Alicante or the bottom of Spain on Google Earth, there's an area down there with glasshouses and tomatoes, and you can see it from the satellite station, outer space. You can see it from it's a block on the landscape, but most of your vegetables and fruits and all come from there. And it's migrant labour from North Africa, and there's no soil. It's grown on rocks. We're using hydroponics. It's a chemical soup that goes in to produce peppers and so on and so forth. Now listen, there's some very good tomatoes growing. I know in Wexford, if you go to one place in Wexford in particular, those tomatoes are absolutely superb. But a lot of them are grown on hydroponics. Most tomatoes you'll get in a supermarket, the cheaper ones, will be the ones that will be on hydroponics, and the flavoursome ones will be the organic ones that some poor devil will hand pick and so on rather than mechanically sort. So it's like this: if you get sick in the morning, you get cancer, you'll find the money. You'll find the money to fight that disease. But fight it before. They say on autopsies done, I see some research done that on autopsies done, we get cancer 3 times in our life. Don't always die from it, we die with it. A lot of people get prostate cancer. Now they operate on it. The person would probably be better off than they wouldn't operate on a lot of cases, an elderly person in particular. But we can feed that cancer or we can starve it. And the same applies to all those different diseases. I see it in animals. There's a myriad of diseases that animals will succumb to if the nutrition is not correct. Same with a human. We're either toxic or we're deficient. And there's about 90 micronutrients. Supplementation doesn't work always. You can think you can take all these supplements. You can actually poison it. The most poisonous thing you can take is probably selenium supplements. If you need it, it's fantastic. But if you don't need it, it's toxic. So you can actually get yourself tested, a hair strand or whatever, a hair sample. You can get yourself tested for what you're deficient in. But the one sure way of getting the essentials is grass-fed beef or lamb. There's no doubt about it. And you can put all the vegetables and things you like with that then, and that'll get the fibre and all the rest, everything moving as it were. But if we don't spend the money on food, we'll spend it on healthcare. And it's a question of deciding which. When you make that decision in the supermarket, and you say you have no power when you go to the polling booth. The most powerful thing a person does is takes out their wallet, what they spend their money on. And that's why there's so much money spent on lobbying and advertising, massive money on advertising. They target kids, and that's why people get distorted views about veganism and so on. They're looking at animals, animated animals on TV, and they think animals have human emotions and so on and so forth. And they believe that animals have memories the same as humans. They don't. I'm a shepherd at night these days because I'm lamb and sheep. But if that lamb gets isolated from the ewe, she doesn't recognise it an hour later. So you're keeping them together, putting them in a pen. Now you can foster on another animal on, another sheep's lamb onto that lamb if you're cute enough and rub the body fluids and so on. But if that animal gets isolated for a period, that animal will die. And they're very vulnerable in this weather and so on. Farmers are working 24/7 trying to keep animals alive. And there was a man who wrote in the paper today, and he was quite shocked. He's farming all his life, but he's quite shocked. He didn't lose much sheep in the snow, but there's a common now afterwards, the shock and the post-trauma and so on, after the snow has melted and the grass is there. Animals are starting to die. You know, the trauma of the snow and the you know what I mean. It was anything that's vulnerable, hasn't got flesh on its bones. That's why it's important to have a level of fat on your body. A level, I say, you know, it's important. That's nature at work, and we mobilise that. That's a store of energy. Fat is absolutely a store of energy. Most attractive, if you're an Inuit man, the most attractive woman that you'll find is the fattest woman you can find going into the winter, because she won't survive the winter if she doesn't have a level of fat on her body. That's absolutely true. And her teeth will fall out of her head chattering with if she doesn't have cover on the bones, as it were, you know. And as farmers, we call it condition, you know. And same with animals. Animals don't taste good if they're not having a condition, if they haven't got fat on their, you know what I mean. That's what gives the flavours, fat. And I think in future, when human diets will be looked at again, it'll be a level of protein of about 40 to 16%, and it'll be a fat level of actually over 50 in the human diet. And with that, you'll have you'll be satisfied with your food, flavours something, tastes good, you won't be starving, you'll have all the micronutrients, and you won't have a high level of cholesterol, because it doesn't go into the blood, it goes right through, and that's in excess. Sugar is what causes cholesterol. Fructose in sugar is actually what makes people fat. If a person wanted not to be fat, you just cut your fructose and carbohydrate level. And that's maybe I'm going on too long here, am I? Well, just it's very, very simple, but study it. The information is available there, but don't take the advertising, you know, healthy food, picture of an orange on a packet of yogurt, because that's a chemical. That flavouring of the orange, it's not an orange, it's a chemical. And the sweetener actually in that, because the fat's been taken out, is actually a chemical fructose syrup. So don't take what you read on the label and what, you know, is not actually what you should be going for. You should be going for the perishable, pure, natural foods that go off, because they're full of nutrition and you know what I mean, they're natural and so on. Vegetables, meats, all those things, milk, not something that'll last. Biscuits now last 5 years on a shelf because they have full of chemicals and so on. So, you know what I mean, that's the way they're made now, and the shopkeeper loves that because he does no waste, you know. Sorry, there's a question.
Just listening to you there since I came in, you have the life frightened out of me, because I wouldn't even know where to start. And I can assure you, if I don't know, and I'd be searching, what 99% of the people have no idea what's going on. Now, we speak about taking cases to the courts, but the Constitution is stacked against us. For example, you look at Article 15 of the Constitution. Government guarantees to pass no law which is in any respect repugnant to the Constitution or any provisions thereof. They're saying, what we do, you can challenge it. But how do we challenge it? We have no money. Because if you go to the solicitor and you speak about your constitutional rights, first thing he says, that'll be 15 grand up front, because we're talking about High Court here. So he wants to have nothing to do with you. Even if you look at it, and I've listened there to the Garda Commissioner, entitled the due process under Article 38. Where's our due process at the side of the street? We have no due process. The guards are taking our property, and they're breaching our constitutional rights under Article 38 and under Article 43, private property. They can't take your house, but they take your car. The whole thing is crazy, and I don't know where we could start to try and fight that. I spoke to a guy by the name of McWerty some years ago, and do you know what he told me? He said there's only three, at that time, there's only 3 High Court judges you could trust in our whole country. Now, they talk about the justice system being independent of the state, But who appoints the judges? So the whole thing is crazy. Listen, I wouldn't even know where to stop here. Thank you.
Right, do you want to go next? Where you go next?
Just to let you know, my own name is Tom O'Callaghan, and I work within the Post Office Network. And first of all, I found tonight very interesting as well. And like the gentleman said, 99% of the stuff that people knew. But that's the biggest problem I find, is that people just don't know what's going on. And I suppose we just can't sit back and allow that to happen. To give an example, the Post Office Network, I'm a city postmaster for the bones of 20 years now. And it's really heartbreaking to see destruction of a wonderful network and to see people being basically ripped apart from a community-based network being put into the financial institutions. And the end result of that, of course, is really what you're doing is you're protecting the shareholders. In 2012, I saw a report. The report clearly stated that if we do not act now, this is in 2012, that 600 post offices throughout this country will just shut down. There isn't one TD, as well you know this now, Seamus, there isn't one TD that doesn't know that report. Every councillor in the country will tell you they want their post office. There is an alternative where it could work very well through the New Zealand model pillar bank, but the big difference is the profits of the pillar banks go to shareholders, but the profit of a community bank go back to the people, and that's the problem. It's not the network isn't viable. Stories being spun that we don't have the modern technology, that's again a fait accompli, because that is not the case. We do have that technology. We have what the people want, but the problem is the tools aren't being given. So it is a big worry. It's a worry for me personally on the post office issue, and again when I hear on the farming side, when you hear then of the way that we're looking at neutrality being questioned, but at what stage do people listen? And that's the difficulty that I see, is that at what stage do people listen? Because what we all know of our country has been ripped apart. And that to me is what's very disappointing. So congratulations, just keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to do as a postmaster what I can, but there is a way, and of course who has the power is the public, of course, but it's getting the messages out. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. Before I say a word, I have to come clean. My name is Tommy Gilfoyle, I'm the chairman of Ennis Sinn Féin. So I am a politically minded person, and I appreciate all the speakers and what they said this evening. My question is for the Senator. I can proudly say that Sinn Féin supports a lot of what you spoke of tonight against TTIP, against CETA, against PESCO. Sinn Féin has tried its best to try and stand up for people who vote for us, to make sure people listen to what we're talking about. But unfortunately, 50+% of the country are still voting for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And like the pillar banks, these are the pillar political parties who have no interest in stopping TTIP, have no interest in stopping CETA, and really want to engage in a European army if you really, as you say, dig down underneath what they're saying on the surface. So my question to the Senator is, how do we get people who won't change their vote, how do we even get them to change the people they vote for in the way they think? Like, I put pressure on lads in my canteen at work or in my trade union hall, and if I start talking about CETA or TTIP, in about 3 seconds they tell me, Tommy, will you stop talking rubbish and talk about something that makes sense? They don't want to listen to me as an activist, but as a senator, have you any way that we can leave this room tonight as activists of this meeting to try and get people of County Clare not to have change in a doctor that went up and hasn't spoke against any of these issues once, not even in his agenda for government, I think, that he speak about these issues. If we are to leave this room as activists against TTIP, against CETA and against PESCO, what advice have you got for us to go out there and spread the word?
I mean, there's loads of good points. I'm going to come back to your one because I think that's the main one directed to me, and I know that you're going to come back in on the post office network, but I think I just want to give an acknowledgement on that, because I think that has been highlighted again and again, that there is that role and there needs to be that role for post offices. And it's interesting, it's exactly what you were describing. We're told that these things are not, going to be profitable enough, they're not going to be, but what they are is sustainable and profitable in a long-term way. And we've seen the same thing anytime things emerge. So in a lot of developing countries, we saw microcredit and microbanking come up. And again, very large banks moved in to try to capture that space. Because with microcredit, what was happening was that it was leaving, the money was staying in communities and it was circling. And I'm not going to jump ahead. I know you're going to be tackling some of that. But I think it's really interesting because, it's actually what Piketty, who's the kind of famous French sociologist, who had a very big book recently coming out, which looked at more and more this push towards away from effectively an income dynamic or a sustainable economic dynamic towards a dynamic which is how do we translate this into wealth. So it's almost, again, it's capital and that kind of over a dynamic of income. So absolutely, these networks and these kind of finance, what they found is they are sustainable, but what they don't do is give you a massive quarterly dividend. They don't give you multiple opportunities to cash out and speculate. The returns are slow. The returns don't always just come back through the post office banking or through the banking system. The returns come out in society and in communities that are sustained and in the businesses that might open, the people who may choose to stay in a town and grow up there. Those are where the benefits come through. And I think that's a real problem we have, is that when we look to profitability, we've had this dynamic where every element is looked to. How does it return immediate profit rather than how does it contribute in terms of to the social good? And maybe sometimes we need to invest in things where the dividend is going to come up in an unexpected way. It might be in someone who stays in school. It might be somebody who opens up a local carpentry workshop, whatever it's going to be. And that's something why I think credit unions are very important, and indeed the post offices. I wanted just to quickly say, and this is around, it's answering you in terms of the activism, and it's something else as well. I love our Heritage Ireland. I would maybe question this idea that it's just this unique Celtic spirit. I think that humans all over the world have a very strong spirit and dynamic for building society and building community, and they do it all the time. And one of the most important things that we can do is joining and linking with other activists. So I think an internationalist perspective. And it really makes a difference. It makes a massive difference because, it sounds, I know we've sounded like we're in a very negative space and very captured space, but I'm actually very optimistic because what we've seen is civil society and groups forming unexpected alliances. We've seen, for example, multiple towns across Europe who've taken a stand on something like CETA and TTIP. We've seen that there's literally villages which might be very, very small, but have been able to put forward a different interpretation of banking. And when all of those individual campaigns join up together, they have an impact. So, for example, on CETA and the trade agreement, they haven't won. We were told 2 years ago it's too late, it's gone, it's over. And it's not over. And those 2 million people, who were 2 million individual people right across Europe who signed... 3.2 million people, individual people right across Europe who signed that petition. And I'm sure their friends and people around them told you, well, that's futile. Yet, it took a couple of years, yet they were found to be correct, they were vindicated, and they got their issues on the agenda, even when they were told it was too late. So I think there's really strong messages there. And I really believe even people who are voting for very conservative parties, unfortunately, and from my perspective, we know that 80% of the Irish public value and care for neutrality. We know, and those are what surveys have found again and again and again. So the fact is, if 80% of the people are valuing that, and a lot of them are going to be Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and voters. So what we need to do is talk to those people, no matter what their political affiliation, and say, bring it, challenge it, bring it to your people, push it. And then, yes, maybe they will get to move their parties. And if they don't move their parties, maybe they will then move themselves to other parties. But I think we need to reach into people on the issues. So again, not a lot of people might be interested in investment courts and all of the rest. But they might be interested in the idea that they want better health regulation. They might want to make sure there's better health standards. They might want to make sure that there is better environmental laws. They might care about workers' rights. And they might want to say, and they might care about gender equality. That's an issue I'm very passionate about. And I want to make sure that if we bring in new laws to improve gender equality, that we're not having those challenged in the courts. So you find the issue that matters to them and you say, there will come a time when there's an issue you care about and you want to know that you can be an activist on it. And that's why we're taking this stand now. It's because we're opening up the arena, the space for civil society. And you just help open that up now, and that's it. And I do think it'll matter, and I do think we should all be activists, and I absolutely believe that we can win. That's why I disagreed with the poster, with no offence to the host, and thank you very much for having me. We're not at an EU army yet, and we won't be part of an EU army because we'll push back. CETA has not been ratified yet, and I don't believe it will be ratified. And we need to have an optimistic, positive story, a story about a better kind of trade deal, and a positive story about a role as peace builders. And what does a positive role as peace builders look like? So on those issues, and on lots of other issues, we need to keep the power of our positive vision out there, and we need to make sure we never assume that the ground is lost. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just start at the end, which was the post offices, because Alice Mary just mentioned them in responding to Tom. Banks create credit out of nothing. Post offices can do the same. Post offices can be profitable in the morning. Just take the monopoly on credit creation away from the banks, from the pillar banks, and give some of it to the post offices and or the credit unions. Secondly, in relation to was it the, I'm still on the banks. Just Tommy, just want to say one thing about Dr. Michael Harty. He's in the Rural Alliance. And no more than your own Leona Riada, MEP and Sinn Féin, the Rural Alliance are seriously behind public banking and community banking. That's where I've had the dealings with them, and I'd have to say that. But we have the utmost support from Sinn Féin right across the board, and that should be put on the record. Richard is gone. He mentioned Article 45, and personally I believe that Article 45, while it's just what they call a directive principle, I think it's a cornerstone of the Constitution. And Richard suggested that maybe we or I or whatever should be suing the politicians. Well, this gentleman here has explained to you why we won't be suing any politicians, because if you go into court and these things, you tend to come out without your house and the shirt off your back as well. But just one last point I'd like to make is that I believe that Ireland has been fixated with foreign direct investment. Now, we're all happy. We're all great to get the kids into Google and Facebook and wherever they have jobs, and it's been great and it's done an awful lot for our country. But it has been at the expense of the indigenous economy. And there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of products that can be made from cattle and sheep and pigs, apart from just what we're eating. Literally dozens and dozens. We could have a sugar industry, as Pat has talked about earlier, and we have a huge potential in our aquamarine sector. But what are we doing with the aquamarine sector? We're destroying it. The ways we're going about exploring for oil is killing and going to destroy fish stocks forever. And the ways that we're going about fishing is so wasteful. Some of the figures are frightening about what we're doing to our aquaculture. Now, Europe doesn't seem to care about that, nor the pillar political parties either. Going back to the foreign direct investment, I mean, whatever they might like to say in the propaganda, it has come about because Ireland facilitated tax haven status for other countries, which actually has made Ireland a tax haven. And, whether we like it or not, that's what it is. But this is at the expense of the indigenous economy. And we need to bring in public and community banking. We will never go anywhere. We can be a Norway. We can be a country like Norway, but with the lack of information that our politicians have, with the sheer incompetence that they display, and with the total lack of leadership, we're going nowhere. So Alice Mary made a very good point. Yes, there's a lot of groups that would not ordinarily be together, coming together, and yes, we're trying to get a voice, and that's why we're here tonight. Thank you.
And I just wanted to acknowledge, just to follow up, that Sinn Féin were very supportive to me in the Seanad when I was pushing the CETA motion, and I know they've pushed that in Europe. But I do think it's that echoing, it's that cross-party and no-party cooperation on each of these issues that's going to be key for getting it over the line.
Thanks very much, Alice Mary. It's in relation to cooperation between politicians. We made history here in Clare when it was declared TTIP was on. But that happened because of cooperation between 3 politicians, possibly 4, and it was cross-party. You know, it was an encouraging sign that given the right issue, people will vote on the issue rather than on the party. And I think we should get hold of that and hold on to it and say it was a microcosm of what's actually needed for the country. But nevertheless, it did happen, it's on the record, you know, and I'll be forever grateful to people I can have, and I'm delighted to see that one of them is here tonight, Anne Norton. She was the proposer of the motion. So there is signs of encouragement. Like this thing about the 3.2 million signatures. The Commission ignored it, you know. But I was in Germany on October, I think it was 3 years ago, and there was 250,000 people on the street of Berlin who were demonstrating against TTIP. And they were from all over Germany. But also, there was at that time, about 2,000 towns and cities throughout Europe who were against TTIP. And they travelled on buses and trains and coaches to get to Berlin. And I was there on a Saturday morning when they were getting off the train. And you couldn't get into the main station. You just couldn't, with the flow of people that were coming out to get into this march. You know, so, and these were ordinary people. Some of them were teachers, some of them were shopkeepers, some of them worked in factories, but they did not want this trade deal because it wasn't good for their economy as they saw it. You know, just as the pillar banks are not good for our economy. You know, this explanation about, oh, we have to have these banks, otherwise the country won't survive. Germany survives very well. And the main reason that Germany survived the big downturn was its lack of dependence on the pillar banks. Its dependence was on these small local banks that lent to local communities at low interest rates, fixed for a long term. So, you know, there are signs of hope. And somebody asked, I know it was a Tommy maybe, that how we spread the message, how do we get people to it? We just keep doing what we're doing. I mean, I wasn't doing this 7 years ago. But because of the fracking, I got involved. And because of the fracking, I learned there was other things that might cause all kinds of problems, particularly the trade deals, because if fracking wasn't banned in this country and ISDS came in through TTIP or CETA, well then we were going to be sued by the large oil corporations. Luckily enough, our government saw some sense and banned fracking. Now, there's other downstream stuff that we have to contend with. But I linked up with people in Germany, and the US, and the UK who were involved in the fracking movement, and we met at COP21 in Paris. Next week, or the week after, I'm going to meet a couple of those in the UK who are fighting against quadrilla. Now, quadrilla mightn't mean anything here, but we buy our gas from a company called Borgosh Energy. And it happens to be owned by Centrica, which is British Gas, which owns 33% of quadrilla. So every time we light up our stove with gas here in this country, we're actually supporting fracking in the UK. But we can also fight it by solidarity with, you know, people fighting on the same issue. But, you know, these people have travelled a long distance here tonight, Dublin, Wexford, Sligo, you know, to talk to you and give up their time. And, you know, I think Barry might say the final closing words, but we really appreciate the fact they took the time to come here to Ennis to share their message with us, to fight the fight that we're trying to fight, and maybe help other people to come along on our journey to change Ireland. So there's going to be a place where our grandchildren can grow up and be proud of, and eat proper food, not be threatened by governments, or not being threatened by conscription into European armies. They can live their life, with a degree of freedom that I felt I had when I was youngster, but it's been diminished. We need to stop that. This is our opportunity, and one of the things, age does not matter in this game. I mean, Michael Campbell there, myself, we are, you can see by the colour of our hair, we're no spring chickens. But we have the courage to stand up and say, this is wrong, this must be changed, please help me change it. And that's what we're doing, we're asking for help to change things. So thank you for being here.
John, just taking 30 seconds. Just one final point, and I'm very sorry I didn't make it earlier, but we all know about this housing crisis and distressed mortgage crisis. Well, in 1928 there was no money available for the development of the agriculture sector, and the government set up the ACC Bank. In 1933 there was no money set up for the industrial sector, and the government set up the ICC. And the Public Banking Forum of Ireland, we have made extensive proposals of government on setting up a special purpose housing bank. It is so simple, it's just a stroke of a pen. I think that because that's such an important thing, I thought I'd rob 30 seconds to say it. And maybe just Michael Noonan. Michael Noonan met with the Vulture funds, and the Department of Finance and Michael Noonan met with the Vulture funds 65 times and organised to give them the housing stock at 20-25%. And give them tax-free status as well. So that's capture. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Seamus. Right, well, thanks for coming here tonight, people. I'm Barry O'Driscoll and John Higgins. We're No-CETA Clare. I would like to thank Alice Mary Higgins, Seamus Maye and Pat Kent, who travelled quite a distance to be here. And above all, I'd like to thank yourselves. The fact you're here means you're not accepting what mainstream media and RT are telling you, that you have inquisitive minds, and those inquisitive minds will certainly be a big plus to you as you journey through life, and you should always ask more. Thanks for coming. We might see some of you in the bar later on. Thanks, lads.